All right, welcome everyone. Holding by the Noahide laws. Again, want to welcome everyone. Holding by the Noahide laws. And we spoke last week. We're going to continue with the monetary laws. Right? We spoke about theft and different things. Difference between, stealing where somebody is aware, stealing where somebody, is not aware. Right? Something by force, something where someone doesn't know, and the question of liability. Right? What exactly is the liability? So we're going to continue. As we see these laws are complex, we're going to continue with the laws of theft, right? And we saw that, we're going to go through, a general overview, of these monetary laws. And again, the idea being to understand these concepts and potential issues that there may be. Now, a common thing is about workplace theft. This comes up quite a bit. Can you partake of office property? Take food, let's say, leftover material, office supplies, these type of things, come up more often than a person may think. So Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 25, 26, that's the source. That's going to be the source over here, right? That we're talking about laborers. So Torah says, when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you have to eat grapes at will until you're satisfied. But you're not allowed to put any in your vessel. Come into your neighbor's standing wheat. You may pick stalks with your hands. You're not allowed to take a sickle into your neighbor's standing wheat. Now, comes on the Gemara, and the Talmud, Bava Metzia, chapter 7, goes through these two verses in great detail. Tremendous amount of detail over here. Now, you look at the verses, they sound, what can we say? It sounds a little bit obscure. Right? First of all, why are you allowed to take grapes from another's vineyard? Right? Obvious question, it's theft. How can you walk into someone's vineyard and take grapes? Right? It should be considered theft. Now, the Gemara goes through the terminology. What does it mean coming into a field? What would I have said? I would have said walking into a field. Right? That would have made more sense. Right? Or, maybe any other phrasing over here. Right? As meaning you're coming into a field for what purpose? To harvest. Right? You're coming into over here, to harvest. That's what it means. Right? That's exactly what it means. You're coming in to a field. Right? Why isn't it called theft? Because coming into a field over here means you're harvesting. Right? That's what it means. So therefore, there are limited rights. Right? Limited rights to a worker to take the produce while working in the harvest. In other words, you're working hard in the harvest. Who says you're allowed to take food? Why would you be allowed to take food? Why isn't that stealing? You're going to say, but you're paid to work. True. Even if you're picking these things, who says I can eat it? Right? Who says I'm allowed to eat it? I shouldn't be allowed to eat it. What I would say. You came to work, not to eat. But if you look at the two phrases, it says you shall not put any in your vessel. Meaning you had a basket, a barrel, whatever. You're not allowed to put this in your vessel. Not only that, but you cannot take a sickle, right? Something that's going to cut your neighbor's wheat. What's it coming to teach you? Restrictions. Restrictions over here. So what are you allowed to eat? You're allowed to eat while the harvest is underway. Once the harvest is finished, you took in all the things or whatever the case is, who says you're allowed to take from the produce? If the harvest is going on, I could take. If the harvest is finished, you're done, so to speak. Not only that, but you're only allowed to take the produce while working if it doesn't cause a net loss or any harm. In other words, if there's no net loss or harm, be allowed to. Right? This is the implication, what it means. It says, you shall not put in any of your vessels. You shouldn't put in any vessel. You shall not take a sickle in your neighbor's, until your neighbor's stand in wheat. In other words, if a person does such a thing, they abuse the rights and they cause a net loss to the employer. That's theft. Just because you're working there and they're busy taking the harvest, who says I'm allowed to take? Eat your own food. Why are you eating your master's food? Right, so to speak. So there are a lot of laws that we're going to see that, we'll look at the modern workplace and we'll see how we learn it out from this verse. Now, if we go soup to nuts through all these laws, we can write books, many, many books on this. So we're going to go through a summary, a summary of these laws. And really, the laws are in chapter 7, tractate Bava Metzia, starting at page 87a. And the Rambam in Hilchos Schiris, that's chapter 12, and that's going to be in the appendix. I'm not going to go through it, but that's at the end of all this. And in the Shulchan Aruch, Hosha Mishpat, and we'll see what the references are for that. Now, so there are a lot of things over here. First of all, a person paid by the hour. Person paid by the hour, you cannot waste time while you're on the clock. In other words, you are working here. Right? So who says, since you're on the clock, I'm allowed to do other things? If you would do other things, you're on the clock, then the employee is guilty de facto of theft. You're taking your employer's money. You're not working. If a person's hired to complete a specific task, let's say you're hired to do something specific, you're paid by the hour, then you have to let his employer know when you're finished. Right? The Choshe Mishpat 331. You got to tell him when you're done. In other words, if you're on the clock, you don't say, well, just, round up that I finished, the hour, when it really only took you 20 minutes, right? Or 25 minutes. If you're on the clock, when you finish, stop. Someone paid by the hour cannot engage in any other work or enterprise while being on the clock. For example, if a person is employed in an office, you're not allowed to work on your own internet business while at work. Right? That's Choshe Mishpat 337 in the Shulchan Aruch. Can't send out emails. Right? Can't look at texts. That's theft. 100%. That's going to be theft because you're on the clock. Yeah, permission may be a different issue when you finish your task. Right? It could be. Until you get another task, you'll be allowed to. But if that's not the case, you're on the clock, you can't do it. What about office supplies? Person cannot use office materials for your own business. While off the clock, such usage would cost the employer money, depreciate value, or utility of the item. Meaning, you're off the clock, you can't come in and print out 50 pages. Now, if the employer allows you, okay. Right? What about 1 or 2 pages? Maybe they won't care. Still need permission. Can't do it without permission. But what are we worried about? It's going to cost the employer money or depreciate the value of it, whatever it is. Now, what about a craftsman? You had a craftsman given material by a client to finish a task. You give him a certain amount of material. Now, what if the craftsman has material left over? Can happen. It's not exact. You have material left over. Who owns it? If the amount of the material is enough to be used or value to the client, craftsman must inform the client and has to return it. In other words, if it's any value to the client could use it, you have to give it back. Question practically relevant, tailors, jewelers, other such craftsmen. So if they have things left over, material left over, if there's value to it, the client can say, I want it. Belongs to me. Now, the source over here, as we mentioned before, mentions a restriction and a right to employers' produce. Now, are Noahides included? They're included. Right? They're included in this rubric of theft. Right? Theft applies to them. Now, what about partaking of produce during the harvest? In other words, they're working, taking in the harvest still going on. Can they take produce? So the Gemara says that includes Noahides in this positive command. Because when it discusses prohibition of theft, common to Noahides and to Jews. So the Gemara, Sanhedrin 57a says, if a vineyard worker ate of the produce while engaged in the actual harvest, that you're allowed to do. Right? In other words, if the harvest is still going on, permitted. But if he ate of it while doing other work, such as pruning, it's constituted as theft. Why? Because you're not doing the harvest. You're doing something else. If you're busy doing something else, that's not the same thing. Therefore, you're guilty. That would be theft. Nonetheless, there are rabbinic authorities that not clear whether Noahides are merely permitted to do so, i.e., it's not called theft, or they have the actual right to eat the produce during the harvest. Now, who cares? All right, what's the practical difference over here? Whether the employer has the right to prohibit his employee from eating of the harvest. Even if you say that it's only a permit and not a right. In other words, it's permitted. Doesn't necessarily mean a person should do it, right? But it's permitted. Then it'll be appropriate for the employer to allow the worker to partake if it's permitted, right? A right means I'm allowed to, no questions asked. If we say it's permitted, okay, doesn't necessarily mean a person should do it, but it may be permitted. Not everything permitted we look at and say, oh, it's permitted, so I can do what I want. No, there could be limitations. Something could be permitted and really you shouldn't do it. Now, if we're not talking about agricultural harvest situation, then this permit or rights not going to have so much application. Right? So an employee should not take or use any of his employer's equipment or supplies for their own benefit. You got to receive permission from the employer to do so. Now, what about a manager? What if he asks the manager? The manager says it's okay. The question is, does the manager have the right? Maybe the manager doesn't have the right. Maybe he doesn't have the right. Maybe he thinks it's okay. The owner thinks it's not okay. Right? But if he's got the power, so to speak, then maybe he can. Right? Maybe he has that power to say you can use it. And it would be okay. You have to know. You have to know what their level of power is. Now, it comes to lands. We're going to continue Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 14. Tells me, do not move your neighbor's boundary mark. What does that mean? Prohibits theft of real estate. I.e., you built on your neighbor's property. Or you moved the boundary marker. Or you took land that wasn't yours. You built a fence a little bit over their property. If they don't let. Kidnapping, Exodus 20, verse 15. Says, do not steal. People not aware. It means do not kidnap. Right? So the Torah uses this phrase we saw before in order to teach two separate prohibitions of don't steal. One is a general prohibition against theft. But over here, can't say it's talking about the same thing. So here, the rabbis tell us it means kidnapping. Not allowed to kidnap. Now, what about restitution? They have an obligation to pay back if they stole. So Leviticus chapter 5, verse 23. What does it tell me? If he transgressed, they are found guilty. Then he has to restore that which he took by robbery or the thing which he gained by extortion or the deposit, which was deposited with him, and he denied it. In other words, the Noahide stole, you can make restitution. Give it back. Or give back the value if you can't. So the Gemara, Baba Kama 66a, tells us, what does it mean he shall restore that which he took means the return of the actual object. Thing itself. Thing itself, you got to return in the original condition. Now, if it's if it is at what it was when it was stolen, then he returns it intact. If not, let's say it's not its original condition, then you got to pay. You got to pay the victim whatever the value of the object is. Whatever the value is, you have to pay him, no matter what was done to the object. You got to pay him the value. Now, if a person, or let's say better, a victim, has hope of getting his property back or money, right? Let's say he's got a choice. You get the property back or money. The thief must return the actual item that was taken. So, if you have reasonable hope getting back his property, that the perpetrator was seen on, or there's a good chance that he can get it otherwise or identify it, then he should get it back. If he can't, let's say stolen item doesn't exist. Right? It's been demolished. Property, let's say, has been demolished. Whatever the case is, the thief must return the monetary value. Right? As the Gemara says in Baba Kama 66a. He can't return the property. There's nothing to return. So what does he give? What's he going to give over here? The value. He's got to give the value. If the thief has altered the stolen item in a permanent manner, meaning he took it, transferred it into something else, made it into totally something else. Now, can he return the item? No, totally something else. So he's considered the owner of the item, but he's got to pay the pre-alteration value to the victim, right? Makes sense. In other words, he's going to have to pay, as the Rambam says, laws of stealing, chapter 2, halacha 1, and Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat 353. He's got to return what it was valued at before it changed. The original value. You're going to say, return it as it is. He didn't want it as it is. He wanted the original thing. So you can't get back the original thing. You get the value. Right? You get the value. Now, what if the victim despaired of getting back his property? Right? Never thought he'd get his property back. So what's the thief liable for? Monetary value. In other words, the victim gave up. He said, no way I'm going to get it back. Person's a mafioso, I'll never get it back. So he's got to get the value. The other person's liable for the value of the thing itself. What do we call being despaired? Where the perpetrator either is not known or it's unlikely will be found. Right? You don't know where he is. Now, it could be that doesn't apply necessarily to Noahides. Maybe Noahides are considered to have despaired, so they have witnesses who can attest to their state of mind. Could be. Right? In other words, maybe you need greater testimony over here to show they really despaired. Now, all of these laws, or let's say better, when you have a stolen item, and that stolen item, let's say, goes up in value, or goes down in value by itself. You didn't do anything to it. While the thief has it. In other words, the thief has it in his hand, the value either goes up or down because of, let's say, market forces. Then the issue of restitution can be complicated. Right? Let's say it's worth less right now, and then when he finally gives it back, it's worth more. Well, what does he pay? Pay the less value, the value what it was, value now. Something like this, you have to, definitely speak to someone competent, in monetary laws. Right? It's complex over here. Now, all these restitution laws apply even if there's no established legal system. And we're going to see each society pretty clear. Noahide laws say you can establish law courts. You can establish courts and laws to impose order and meet the needs of the community. Therefore, Torah's laws of restitution may be modified or supplanted by the needs of the court. So it can change. Right? Things in theory, could change according to the way the court, court sees it. And maybe the laws are not exactly the same. For Noahide. It's a whole question. Right? There's a whole question over here. Yeah, so not so simple. That I can hear. These laws extremely, extremely complicated because how do you judge what the value is? How do you see what the value is? You see, you say it's the value right now, but now the value is worth less. Let's say when he took it, it was worth 100. He still has it intact, but it went down. Now it's worth 20. So what does he pay? Does he pay when he stole it, when it was at 100, or right now, what the value is now? Or maybe it went up, right? Maybe he stole it, it was worth 100. Now it's worth 220, right? Does he have to pay the higher value, right? So that's complex. That 100% is complex. So that you need, experts in monetary laws, to explain that. So now we have this appendix of the Rambam, so I'm not really going to go through it. I think it's, pretty much self-explanatory, not really. I mean, this is where the laws are derived from, but, I'm not going to go through all of them. So, yeah, I guess that'll be that. Any questions on that? Making restitution, kidnapping, lands, summary of laws of employees. I'm sure the laws of employees come up a lot. I'm sure it probably comes up a lot. And in general, workplace theft. Any questions on any of that? If you want to make it easy, you can unmute yourself. Too hard to write.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No problem.
Okay, so sometimes if I go to a fast food restaurant and they order wrong, they get the order wrong, I come back and say, hey, you got this order wrong. They give me the right order. Or if I'm waiting too long, sometimes they'll say, hey, let us give you an extra, I don't know, order of fries or a drink.
Right.
For the convenience. Sometimes, I guess more specifically, my question is kind of a more general question. When an employee wants to do a favor for a customer, here in California where I live, the state charges a bag fee. Right. So every time you get grocery bags, you have to pay 10 cents.
Right.
And some of the employers say, hey, you know what? Just go ahead and take the bag. We're not gonna make you pay the fee for that. So, usually I'll say, no, please let me pay the fee. But what would be the right thing to do in that case?
The question is, do they have the power to do such a thing? In other words, if they're doing it as a favor to you, they don't have a right to do. Who says they have a right to do that? If you tell me, listen, let me speak to the manager says, yeah, you can keep it, not a problem, or not, and he has that kind of power, then fine. Right? But a regular employee, if they would say, this is what the boss says, this is what the boss allows, I don't know if he's got believability. I don't know if he's got believability to say such a thing. Right? Usually an employer doesn't have that kind of power. Manager certainly may have that kind of power. So if they say, listen, I want to speak to the manager, and the manager says, yeah, you can keep it, so then you can keep it. But if a regular employer says it, they want to, keep you on as a good customer or whatever, because you got a kickback, yeah, they don't have a right to do that. The question is it causing the owner damage? Serious damage we saw before. So you're going to say 10 cents. We have the same thing here, right? Same thing in Israel. Right? It's a minimal amount. Who's causing the damage? You say causing damage to the environment, not necessarily to the person. Maybe. You're going to say he's not going to miss 10 cents. Okay. That may be true. He might not be causing damage, but who says he's got the right to do it? Right? Doesn't have the right to do it. Right. One other thing I'll mention is a question you asked, last week. I think it comes out that if they called you in for a full day, they should pay you for a full day. Right? I think it's pretty clear. That, even if they say, well, it's onus, this, that, doesn't matter. They're liable for a full day. But they say we're going to compensate you half a day. Now, the thing is, you could fight it. You definitely could fight it, but you made a very good point, and that is that if they come back, you give them a hard time, and then they see that, like, it's so easy to deal with, so they're not going to give you as many jobs, right? So then I would say, yeah, it's not worth it going after them because you want to get other jobs, right? But you should be liable, right? They should be liable. They should have to pay. They 100% should have to pay. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They didn't know about it ahead of time, whatever. They dragged you in, right? They should pay you for a full day. Onus doesn't work over here. If it was before you came in, maybe. Right? If it was before you came in, didn't change your whole day, it's one thing. But you're already there, you come in, they're liable. Right? But you're right. If you're gonna say what, you're gonna say that if I make a stink, they're never gonna hire me for anything. Yeah. Then yeah, I would agree. You shouldn't do it. Right? But according to Torah, they'd be liable. 100%. 100% they should be liable. That's the way that comes up. So a lot of these things you gotta be careful, in these type of places where someone says, yeah, just take it, don't worry. Now, it could be, it's not like such a huge loss, to the owner, but the problem is they don't have the power. They don't have the power to look the other way and say, yeah, just take it, it's fine. They don't have power. If you're telling me the manager says it, and the manager says, yeah, according to the owner, this, that, and the other thing, they have the power to do it, okay. Right? Then you don't have to worry about it. But a regular employee? No. Right? So yeah, yeah, just take it. No, you should say, I can't. Here's 10 cents. Thank you very much. And that's it. Yeah, again, 10 cents doesn't mean a whole lot. Right? It's not a significant amount of money. Doesn't matter. Right? The question is it theft or not? And by a non-Jew, it doesn't have to be a significant amount of money. It can be 5 cents, it could be a penny. Doesn't matter. Theft is theft. Yeah, that's what I would say. Any other questions?
Yeah. So a little off the subject, but I heard before that if there's a rainbow and it stretches from horizon to horizon, not just a partial rainbow, but yeah, basically, yeah, full arc. You're not supposed to stare at it.
Right.
So the other day, I think it was either this last week or the week before, I actually saw one like that when I was driving to work. And I looked to the left, I looked to the right, I could still see it as far as it went. And I'm just wondering, what is that? I think I heard something about it. Yeah.
What's the problem with staring at a rainbow?
No, I didn't stare at the rainbow. Well, what I had heard was something about it's disrespectful to stare at it because it represents a covenant, and it may be that somebody's breaking the covenant.
Right. That's one thing. That's definitely one thing. Looking at it not intensely, is one thing. You can look at it without an intense stare, right? That would be okay. What's the reason? It corresponds to the Shekhinah, God's presence. So you look at it, it's like you consider looking at God's presence. You can't look at God's presence, right? That you're not allowed to. Again, it's part of the covenant. Also brought down that if you look at it excessively, consider not to care in the honor of his maker. Right? Better you didn't come into the world. That's pretty bad. Also could cause your eyesight to weaken. Also bad. And there are husks or klipas, what we call according to Kabbalah, that surround the rainbow, trying to darken its light, explaining another reason why I shouldn't look at it. Now, there's another question here. Interesting question. If you see a rainbow, you're allowed to tell others about it. All right. So I see one of the commentators here says no, considered slander. And if you told somebody, there's no obligation to go see it and recite the blessing. So you shouldn't take a picture of it. Publicizing it would be, also be bad. Some say you should avoid seeing a reflection, of a rainbow. Again, what's the purpose of a rainbow? To arouse divine mercy. All right, grant protection. All right, it's a sign that evil people have reached the point of needing destruction, and that our forefathers prayed on their behalf to save them. Well, that's pretty bad. Right? In other words, it shows potential destruction. That was the sign that God's not going to destroy the world again. Yeah, that's the story. That is the story. That's the story about a rainbow. Yeah. Any other questions? On or off?
A little further on that. Yeah, with all the rainbow, I'm thinking, okay, what's coming? What's about to happen here? Because basically, I know we've talked about it before, but yeah, just I know in general the way society is, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah. Well, I'm just wondering, does this force? How could I put it? I don't want to say, heaven forbid, like an omen or anything, but I'm thinking, okay, well, does this mean? What does it mean as far as what brought this on? I guess it's more what I want to ask.
It's what it represents, right? In other words, it's like you're looking at God's presence, right? You're not allowed to look at God's presence. That's kind of being haughty, right? Being, conceited. If it's, again, it depends on how you're looking. If you're staring at it excessively, right? That's definitely a problem. That's definitely a problem. But you're not showing proper honor to God, essentially. Not only that, it's not necessarily a good omen either, right? In other words, to look at it, to look at it and stare at it because it represents destruction. It's the covenant God made between God and the Jewish people. True. But what does it really represent? God says I'm not going to destroy the world again. But if you see a rainbow, doesn't it mean that, we just mentioned, right? Is that, it should arouse divine mercy, grant its protection. But it's a sign that the evil people reach the point of needing destruction. So we need divine mercy, right? That's what it represents. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It does clear things up a little bit because yeah, I'm just thinking, okay, maybe when I see that again, maybe it's time to start praying for mercy for other people or for
right.
Yeah.
It's not a good sign. That's people think, oh, it's a beautiful thing, this, that. It's not, it's the covenant God made after destruction. After the destruction of the world, that's not a good sign. Right? It's a sign it's not going to destroy the world again, okay? Right? But it's in and of itself, it's not a good sign, period. Let's say that.
Okay. 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 I know I have another question. I think I might want to email you out, but
okay.
Yeah.
Any other relevant questions to ask not on topic? I don't mean irrelevant. I mean, like, come on, was I getting on topic? Come on, let's go. Let's have some fun here.
Yeah. No, I don't I mean, they are. I've been thinking. I've been having questions through the week, but they're not coming to mind right now.
You know when the best time you have questions are either in the middle of prayer or in the bathroom. Those are the best times. Murphy's Law. It's like, I said, yeah, a great question in the bathroom. I was like, yeah, but you know, I don't think Torah in the bathroom. That's the whole point. Right? But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. Sorry, I'm about to start stammering, but yeah, it's a lot of times I'll have questions. If I don't write them down, I'll forget about them. But thinking about the subject though, yeah, it's hard as a Noahide because with the paper bag, with the bag fee, for instance, I've had employees, you know, at the cash register, they try to say, "Oh, just take the bag, you know, don't worry about the fee." I practically have to argue with them about it. You know, I'm really, it's like a serious pressure thing. I'm like, no, I want to pay it. Let me pay it.
Listen, if it comes to that, because like, listen, let me speak to the manager. You know, just settle it that way. And if you know, if the manager says you're allowed to take it, you're allowed to take it. Right? You know, if he's got that kind of power, which he probably does. Right? Most managers probably can make those type of decisions. So if they say, listen, yeah, just take it, not a problem. You know, then you're okay. You know, but an employer, that's a problem. They don't have free reign. They don't have, you know, free reign to do what they want. That's that's stealing. No question. They're helping you steal. That's, you know, they're guilty and you're guilty. Right? They don't have the power to do that. They're taking a loss for their employer. Even if it's a minor loss, then you're guilty of stealing. So 100%. So yeah. You should definitely fight them on it, but you know, maybe better just to, if you have that problem again, just say, you know, I want to speak to the manager, and that's it. You know, that doesn't matter. You know, you'd rather look stupid in the eyes of man than stupid in the eyes of God. You know, so let people talk and let them say, and you know, whatever. It's like, come on, it's 10 cents, just go. No, you know, do you ever hear the Noahide laws, dummy? That's stealing. You know, what do you have a right? You know, rebuke them, say, you moron. You're not allowed to steal. That's stealing. Like, no, it's not stealing. It's only 10 cents. It's stealing. It doesn't matter. That doesn't really matter.
Okay, I appreciate that, Rabbi.
No problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So I have a question about discount too, but sometimes, you know, at stores they'll like if I go to a fast food restaurant, sometimes I ask, hey, do you all have a military discount veterans? And sometimes they'll say yes, sometimes they'll say no. Sometimes within the same business, or how can I put it? I think some fast food places, they have franchises. So they might have different owners for different places, but some places I'll say, hey, do you have this this discount? And we have a restaurant called d.Leftover. And they'll say, yeah, sure. I'll just put it under senior discount. So they have an option on their cash register for senior discount. But I've asked them before, you know, once I've even asked them, okay, so are you sure it's okay to give me this discount? And they say, yeah, it's just that we don't have that button on our cash register. We don't have that option on the cash register.
Right.
But yeah, I'm thinking I might need to be a little more careful about that.
Yeah, you just, you know, again, you know, what these people are telling you, you know, they may not have the right to do it. So, you know, it just needs clarification. You know, if they have the right to do it, very good. You know, if that's what the policy is, that's what the policy is. If that's not what the policy is, and they're saying, okay, you know, just take it, whatever, that's a problem. Definitely a problem. I would think in an office, it's definitely more common. You know, taking paper, taking pens, you know, other things. They don't belong. They totally, you know, don't belong. You know, if they allow you, listen, to print 1 page, 2 pages, personal things, okay. Right? You do more than that, you're taking advantage. You're definitely taking advantage. If they allow you to print out things, 10 pages or whatever. Okay, most places probably not. So yeah, I'm sure this happens all the time. That people are supposed to be doing something, they haven't finished, or whatever the case is. They take a break that they're not allowed. They sit there fiddling around, and they get back to work. I'm sure they're not off their phones 100% while they're working. Right? I've gotten texts before from people who say, they answered the text and said, I'm working, whatever, but they answered it. So you can say, well, maybe you're putting some block in front of them. How do I know they're working or not? I have no idea. Right? So it's not on me per se, but if they're texting and they're not allowed to text and they say, oh, I can't talk to you right now, I can't text, I'm at work, well, you're not allowed to text. It's not just, well, I can't text. You shouldn't be texting right now. Yes, that's a problem. That's definitely a problem. Yeah. Any other questions?
No, I think that's all, Rabbi.
Okay.
Yeah, if I start asking more, if you give me any more time, I'll probably start trying to brainstorm questions. So we got to do that later.
Great. Any other questions? Feel free. Definitely. Shoot me an email. Definitely get a chance to get back to on that, or at least send you a virus one way or the other. Sorry, that slipped out. Yeah, not a problem. Definitely not a problem. So good. So I'm going to sign out. You have any questions, again, feel free. You can shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'm going to sign out. Wish everyone a good middle of the day, almost end of the day for me. And everyone have a great rest of the week.
You are currently the only person in this conference.